Do you want to start recording then?
Sure.
Okay, so welcome to the IMA Data Science Seminar. So I'm very happy to introduce Kevin Zhu today. So he got his PhD from the University of Michigan with Alfred Hero in 2012. So he's now an assistant professor at Case Western Reserve University. His research interests are in machine learning and network sciences. And he's talking to us today about continuous time probabilistic generative models for dynamic networks. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Yeah, so continuous time probabilistic generative models for dynamic networks, like this dynamic network here. I like showing this animation because I wrote the software to go and generate this myself back during my PhD. So this is one example of a dynamic network. So you see here, you've got 17 nodes. These are different people housed together in fraternity housing at the University of Michigan back in the 1950s. So each node here is a person. And then a group of researchers went to visit these people every week and asked them to rank how they felt about the other people. And so we have this network that's changing over time as people's preferences change. And so this is an example of a dynamic network. We'll be talking about these today. And before I go into that, I just want to give a brief overview of my current research areas. So the bulk of my research is focused on network science, and we're interested in problems such as, hey, given a network that we observe, so this is a synthetically generated network of 20 nodes here, can we answer questions such as, which of these two edges is more likely to be formed in the future? Or in general, what's the probability of forming, let's say, this edge at some point in the future compared to this edge? And so these could be social networks where these are people and the edges correspond to friendships, or the edges could correspond to, two people interacting in some way or being in physical proximity. So these are more fundamental network science problems. And then we also look at problems in biomedical and health informatics. So one example here is wearable data analytics. So what we have here, this is an Empatica E4, think a souped up Fitbit that you wear on your wrist. It senses a lot of sensors here. So you got a PPG sensor here to go and collect heart rate data. You have these here are measuring your skin conductance. And so we stick these sensors, on people while we subject them to different kinds of stimuli. And then there are a lot of data analysis challenges here. So people wear this on their wrists, they move their arms a lot. And you'll get a lot of these artifacts due to movements. So we call these baseline shifts as people move their wrists around, which tend to obscure the actual signals that you're trying to extract from here. These are called SCRs, or skin conductance responses. These are the results of microbeads of sweat being expelled from your skin, when you're subject to some kind of stimuli, like let's say somebody has a loud bang that scares you. Other areas of biomedical and health informatics that my group works on. So one problem we've been looking at is survival prediction for organ transplants. And so as many of you might know, there's a long waiting list for people who need organ transplants, let's say like a kidney transplant. And so last time I checked, it was over 90,000 long. So you've got this long waiting list of people who need a kidney transplant. And then let's say a donor all of a sudden becomes available. So let's say this poor guy gets hit by a car, dies, and you see, oh, this person's an organ donor. He's got 2 kidneys to go and give to some candidates. Well, you've got 90,000 here. And let's say in some local area, you've got a whole bunch of candidates here. You could just give the kidney to the first person on the list, the person who's been waiting the longest. But what if that kidney is a bad match for that recipient? Then the recipient's body is going to reject the transplant, and now we just wasted a kidney. And so we have this donor here, we have these possible candidates, and one of the things we try to do is model the compatibility between the donor and the recipient through, these are called HLAs, human leukocyte antigens. And so the idea is the better the match between the donor and the recipient's HLAs, generally the better the recipient will tolerate that that transplanted kidney. And so we do some network stuff here also, where we try to go and predict the compatibility between some donor HLA and some recipient HLA. And my talk today, I'm going to talk about the network science stuff. I'm happy to go and chat about the biomedical and health informatics if you're interested in that stuff afterwards. So here's an outline for my talk today. I'll start off by giving some background information, the fundamental, both the overarching goal that of my research here and some fundamental building blocks that we use to build these probabilistic generative models for dynamic networks like Hox processes. So I'll start off with some background. I'll talk about our contributions here, in particular, two models, the CHIP and the MULCH model, and then I'll conclude with a summary here. And so to start off, I'm sure many of you are aware, networks are everywhere around us. There are many complex physical, biological, and social phenomena are very naturally represented by networks. So here are some dated pictures here. This is a graphic of what the internet looked like back in 1998. When I say the internet here, I mean the physical network of routers, not the World Wide Web. So this was an old picture from Wired magazine. And then we have here, this is a social network of school friendships collected by Moody. And you see that the different nodes here are colored by race. So the yellow nodes here, these are the white students. The green ones are the black students. The red nodes are the other. And then these were both at a junior high and a high school. And so you see I think that these were the junior high students and these were the high schools. But you can see the friendships are highly segregated by race here. And so this was of interest to sociology. And so you have many different complex systems that are naturally represented by these kinds of relations or networks. And there's been a significant interdisciplinary effort dedicated to analyzing network. This field of network science, very interdisciplinary. So early contributions from sociology, and then leading to the physicists, computer scientists, information science, electrical engineering, stats, math, and so on. And what I want to focus on today here is the generative model. So I argue that the development of generative models for network data is an important step to understanding behavior at the network level. So beyond the level of the individual nodes in the network. And to summarize what I do, I build probabilistic generative models for dynamic networks where this network structure changes over time. And I'll start off with some basics here. So we can represent a network by an adjacency matrix A, and it's a square matrix n by n, where n is the number of nodes, let's say the number of people in the network, and the entries are binary. So entry ij is 1 if nodes I and j have an edge. So this could be, let's say, a friendship between people I and j, and 0 otherwise. So here's an example of a network here with 6 nodes. So notice we have edges between some, not others. And then here's the matrix. So notice we have an edge between nodes 1 and 2. So we have a 1 here. The blue dots are the ones. We have an edge between nodes 1 and 3. So again, a blue dot here or a 1 in the matrix. But then no edge between 1 and 4. And so we don't have a 1 here. So the zeros correspond to non-edges. So this definition can be easily extended to directed and weighted networks. Now, one thing I want to point out, when you have a matrix like this, this is one common way to try to visualize it. Look at the sparsity patterns, the ones and the zeros. One of the challenges with the network here is that row and column permutations to this matrix don't change the network, as long as you apply the same permutation to the rows and the columns. So if I permute columns 2 and 3, and I permute rows 2 and 3, I haven't changed the network. I just changed the labeling. I just turned node number 2 here, and I'm calling it number 3 instead. And similarly, number 3, and now I'm calling number 2. And so as long as you apply the same permutation to both the rows and columns, you haven't changed the matrix itself. The network itself. You change the matrix, but not the network. And this can often obscure a lot of structure in your network. So if I show you this, these are two different adjacency matrices for the same network, just with different orderings of nodes. And if you look at this one, this is just randomly numbered compared to this one here, where we've chosen a different node ordering. And notice you can see a lot of structure here. So it looks like you've got a lot of ones here in this block, a lot of ones here in this block. So we typically call these two communities of nodes, or people who, let's say, have a lot of edges amongst themselves, but not many outside. And with a different permutation, like this is how you would maybe get the data to begin with. You can't go and see this. And so this is one of the main challenges in working with networks here. Now, this is one of the reasons why we need to have tools to help us analyze these networks. And one tool that I think is very important here is probabilistic generative models. And a generative model is a model that allows creation of new data that resembles observed data. And so in a probabilistic generative model, you have some data generating process. So that creates your observed data. So this is a probabilistic model. And then in practice, you have your observed data here, and you want to go and estimate some parameters from your data generating process, your probabilistic model, with the idea that knowing the values of these parameters can help you explain the structure in your network. And so in a probabilistic generative model, you explicitly encode the data distribution, so the distribution for the observed data as a probabilistic model. You can use this to study and evaluate plausible mechanisms that explain the underlying process. So whatever process generated that data. So if your data is a social network, perhaps the underlying process here is how people form acquaintances, friendships, or how people interact. And you can incorporate different hypotheses or theories into the model to be tested. And so these can all go into constructing that data generating process. And then it also provides a principled framework for model extension, for different data types like dynamics, which I'll talk about today. Now, these days when I talk about generative models, I have to add a disclaimer here. There's another class of generative models called deep generative models, for example, generative adversarial networks, or GANs. And the kinds of generative models I'm talking about here are different from these. They're both generative in that they can create new data that resembles observed data. The deep generative models actually have usually much better performance when it comes to generating realistic data in many domains, or particularly with images and such. But they don't facilitate an understanding of the underlying process that generates the data. So a GAN is not at all trying to shed any light on what the underlying process you're modeling is. It's just trying to go and generate data that looks realistic, right? Which is different from the kinds of generative models that I'm talking about today. So when we talk about generative models for networks, if we go, the simplest random graph model going way back, Erdős-Renyi or GNP model, here you just assume that edges are formed between any two nodes independently with some probability P. So it's a very simple model. It's too simple, right? Inflexible to represent many phenomena. Oops, sorry. And normally we try to represent networks using a larger set of parameters to capture the properties in the network. And a tool we often use is a latent variable models, where your observed variables, so your data, are dependent on a set of unobserved or latent variables. And we typically assume that the observed variables are conditionally independent given those latent variables. So that those latent variables are capturing the structure in the data. If you're wondering, why latent variable models, there's lots of tools we can use. One of the justifications behind using latent variable models is that the adjacency matrix is invariant to row and column permutations that I showed you just a couple minutes ago. And there's this theorem from Aldous and Hoover that implies the existence of a latent variable model of this form, which says that your adjacency matrix entries, Aij, there exists some function H that's a function of these independent and identically distributed latent variables, Zi and Zj for I and j, and then you have some variable here that is a function of both of these, and then you have some variable that is not a function of either, so some fixed variable. So the Aldous-Hoover theorem, it's an existence theorem, so it implies the existence of a latent variable model of this type, where you have independent and identically distributed latent variables. Now, it's an existence theorem. It doesn't tell you anything about what that function H looks like, what the latent variables should be, what they should be. So typically, we assume some structure for the H and for the Zi and Zj, and different models assume different latent representations in generative structure. But basically, the probability distribution for the adjacency matrix A, given the latent variable Z and some parameter theta, you can now factorize over all of the individual node pairs I and J. And typically, we choose the latent variable to provide an interpretable representation. And that's where this helps us to go and analyze these networks. So one such latent variable model for networks is called the stochastic block model, and it's based off of some sociological theory, which is structural equivalence. So two nodes are said to be structurally equivalent if their relations to all other nodes are identical. So if you have two people who have the exact same set of friends, they are structurally equivalent. That's a very strict requirement. So if we relax it, we can get this notion of stochastic equivalence, which says that if two nodes have the same probability of connecting to all the other people, then they're stochastically equivalent. Or in other words, if you have a group of nodes, all of the nodes in that group have the same probability of connecting to other groups. So it's a relaxed version of this structural equivalence, a probabilistic relaxation. And we say that a random adjacency matrix A is generated according to an SBM, a stochastic block model, with respect to a latent vector C that has k different blocks if your AIJs, your adjacency matrix entries, the ones and zeros, are conditionally independent given C. And then if you have two nodes, I and I prime in the same block, J and J prime in the same block, then the distributions of Aij and AI prime, J prime are identical. So all that matters is what block or what group you belong to. Everybody in that group is stochastically equivalent. So here's an illustration. Let's say we have a network here with 9 nodes. We have 3 different blocks or groups. So nodes 1, 6, and 4 are in the same group. Nodes 8, 2, 3, and 5 are in the same group. 9 and 7 are in the same group. And then you have this matrix here of edge-forming probabilities, which says that nodes in group 1 form edges with other nodes in group 1 with probability 0.1. Nodes in group 1 form edges with nodes in group 2 with probability 0.9. So this is a k by k matrix. And then you get back here your possible adjacency matrix showing the different edges that get formed. Now, in practice, right, you don't know the latent block vector, you don't know the edge forming probabilities. All you observe is the adjacency matrix, and not even in this permuted form, right? This is permuted to show the blocks. And so you need to find a way to estimate these from that adjacency matrix. And the typical approach, so if you know already the blocks, it's pretty easy. The maximum likelihood estimate of the probability of forming edges is just the number of actual edges in that block pair divided by the number of possible edges. And that's assuming you know the blocks memberships already. If you don't, the maximum likelihood over those latent blocks is intractable. Basically, you have on the order of k to the power of n possible latent class or block vectors, because that's a discrete variable. And so you need to come up with ways to approximate these. So spectral clustering techniques have been shown to accurately estimate these latent classes. And the basic idea here is you take the singular vectors of the adjacency matrix, or possibly a transformed version of that, to go and estimate your classes. And then you run k-means clustering on the rows of the singular vector matrix. And then there's many different variants of these with differing theoretical guarantees. Basically, these guarantees are stating that as the number of nodes grows to infinity, eventually the number of errors that the spectral clustering algorithm makes goes to 0. And the algorithms, the spectral clustering algorithms themselves can be made pretty, to scale pretty well to roughly 1 million nodes. So again, you start off with this adjacency matrix here where you don't see the structure. You run spectral clustering on this, and then you get back which nodes are in which groups. You can permute the adjacency matrix, and you can go and see the structure here. And then you can substitute these entries into this equation here to go and get back your edge probabilities. So in this way, you can get back an estimate of which people or which nodes in your network are stochastically equivalent. Now, what I showed you there was just for a single network or a static network. That's just a single snapshot. And that snapshot is insufficient for representing many complex phenomena. And so in particular, it's unable to capture temporal dynamics. Most complex systems we're interested in modeling change over time. And so the solution here is to analyze these dynamic network representations where the structure of the network is changing over time. And then, the question is, what does dynamic network data look like? So this is what I showed on my title slide here, this dynamic social network of 17 people changing week by week. So this is an example of what a dynamic network looks like. And then secondly, how should we model a dynamic network, right? I showed you these latent variable models like the stochastic block model for modeling one network, but now we also have this time component. These things are changing over time. So then how do we model that time component? And in this area, so when I talk about networks and dynamics, there's two types of network dynamics people typically consider. So one type, the distinction is very subtle. I say this is dynamics on networks. So this is a study of the dynamics of some stochastic process, let's say the spread of information or the spread of disease over a static network. So let's say you have a fixed network like this, and this person wants to go and start a rumor. And then you see over time, this person has propagated the rumor to these people who then go and spread that rumor even further. And so here, this is called dynamics on networks. So you have some process taking place on the network itself, but the network is not changing. On the other side, you have dynamic networks. So you don't have on here. And here, the network structure itself is evolving over time according to a random process. So you have edges can be added or removed over time, or even a new node, or nodes can be added or removed. And so this is what I'm going to talk about here, these dynamic networks. And so the first distinction I'm going to make is discrete versus continuous time. And so in discrete time network data, you have snapshots at discrete time steps. Let's say like 1 week, like in the network I showed you previously. And nodes and edges can both appear and disappear over time. So notice here we have these 3 snapshots. And this can be very easily represented by just a sequence of adjacency matrices. So you have an adjacency matrix for the network here, an adjacency matrix for the network here, an adjacency matrix for the network here. It's also known as network panel data. Now this, I think, is pretty straightforward, just a sequence of adjacency matrices. Continuous time network data is more complex. So here I'm assuming you have relational events with fine-grained timestamps. Either an exact timestamp or, with a digital computer, nothing's ever exact, right? Nothing's ever continuous, but discretized at a fine-grained enough level. So let's say to the level of 1 second, or if you're collecting data over long periods of time, let's say you're collecting data over 20 years, maybe to the level of 1 day. So I mean, very fine-grained. And so this continuous time network data, you can represent this by triplets. So I call these U, V, and T, meaning that node U, I call them senders, receiver, and timestamps. So node U initiated some type of interaction with node V at timestamp T. So here's an example. We have a sender. So this is a node ID, sent a message to this receiver here at this is a Unix timestamp. And so your network is represented by this relational event table. So this is also called timestamped relational event data. And so you don't have just a sequence of adjacency matrices because you've got here these exact or close to exact timestamps. And so this is a lot more challenging to go and work with this kind of data. And I'm make another, yeah, go ahead.
You have like a UVT. So does that mean that at time T, we have an edge between U and V?
Yeah, exactly. And so this is an instantaneous edge. So think of it as like you sent a message to V at time T. Okay. So that's what this is. Actually, this data came from Facebook wall posts. So this person posted on this person's wall at this time. Yeah. So we've got these instantaneous edges with fine-grained timestamps. So this is the difference between the discrete time and the continuous time data. Now, when I talk about the models, so in a discrete time network model, you want to build a model for these edge probabilities, UVT, for discrete T. So you can have this set, let's say, for T being 1, 2, up to some time duration, capital T here. So maybe these are, different days or different weeks or whatever. And in between those times, you have nothing. And so typically what you do here is assume some hidden Markov or similar structure for the adjacency matrices where your latent variables or parameters follow these Markov dynamics, so this short-term memory, and then the network snapshot at each time is generated according to a static network model like a stochastic block model. So that's the discrete time setting. In the continuous time setting, we want to model these edge-forming probabilities, so the probability that U and V have an interaction at time T for arbitrary T. So any real value T, I should say, this should be R plus, right? Time starts at 0. It's only positive. And so here, what we typically do is combine a latent variable representation for the nodes with a temporal point process or TPP model for the event times. And so these are often called time-stamped relational event models. So that's the distinction now between the models. And so I want to briefly summarize the discrete time network models. It's not the focus of this talk, but there's been a lot of research done in this area. So here you have network snapshots at these discrete time steps, which you can model as, let's say, a sequence of adjacency matrices, which can change in size as nodes enter and leave the system. And you model each snapshot using a generative model for static networks like a stochastic block model. And then you incorporate some time dependence on the model parameters. So what you observe here is this sequence of adjacency matrices, and you assume that the parameters or the latent variables here are follow a Markov model here, so that's where you have your continuity over time. So this is an example. It's a hidden Markov structure. It's not the only structure, but it's a structure that is typically used. And there's been a lot of work in this area, many discrete time stochastic block models. So some of my work back from 8 or 9 years ago was in this area. And then you had Mattia and Miel, some statisticians who came along and improved upon the models that my collaborators and I had built. And then most of the work in this area now is very theoretical, trying to establish under what conditions we can go and recover your parameters exactly. So that's the discrete time setting. That was the focus of, there's a lot of model innovation there, I would say, 5 to 8 years ago. I want to talk about continuous time today. And in continuous time, the main building block we have here are temporal point processes, which are used to model irregularly occurring events in continuous time. And a temporal point process, so it's characterized by an intensity function, which is the intensity at any given time t, given the history of the process, so what happened in the past. It's the expected number of events that occur in a small time window, delta t, roughly speaking. So it's the limit here as delta t goes to 0. So that's the intensity at time t. And there are many temporal point processes that are used in practice. So the most common one is a homogeneous Poisson process, where this intensity is constant. So the red line here is the intensity. The little black lines here, these are the times at which events occur. People use inhomogeneous Poisson processes where you allow this intensity to change over time. This can be used to model things like diurnal patterns. So if you're trying to model cars arriving into a parking garage, maybe this process will have a peak here around 9 o'clock or whenever people get to work. And then you have a Hawkes process where the intensity of the process changes, not necessarily based on external factors, but based on the events generated by the process itself. And so the intensity function is also a random process. So notice the times at which the intensity changes, right? The intensity has these sudden jumps here, line up with the times of the events here. And so in this case, the Hawkes process is self-exciting. It can give you these clusters of events that occur in very short periods of time. So you see that over here or over here and so on. And as I mentioned, a Hawkes process, it's a self-exciting temporal point process, which means the arrival of an event increases the chance of the next event arrival immediately afterwards. And so the conditional intensity function, given the event times, it has some base rate. This is like your homogeneous Poisson process rate, plus this term here where after each event, so TS here is the time of a previous event, you have this jump alpha, and then you have gamma here. This is called the kernel function that controls the decay. And the typical function that's used for the decay here is an exponential kernel. So you assume you have this instantaneous jump in your intensity, and then you have this exponential decay here. It's both mathematically convenient and also a good fit for many data types. And so the function ends up looking like this. You have a base intensity, mu. That's a rate at which things normally happen. And then each time you get an event, the intensity jumps by this size alpha. So that's the size of the jumps that you see here. And then you have a decay characterized by this beta. That's your exponential decay rate. So this is a Hawkes process. That's one variable. Let me now talk about the multivariate Hawkes process. It has d different variables, and it's both self and mutually exciting. So you have here d different variables. Now you have a vector of length d for your base intensity, and then you have matrices alpha and beta for the jump sizes and the exponential decays. And to give you, I'll give you a simple example here. This is a bivariate example. So we have two different variables. So your mu is mu1 and mu2. So let's say 1.5 and 0.5. These are the rates at which these two types of events happen. Then you have a 2x2 matrix alpha here. So this is saying that an event of type 1 will cause the intensity to jump by 2, the intensity of type 1. An event of type 2 will cause the intensity of type 2 to jump by 3, but then you also have these diagonal terms, which control how much an event of type 1 will go and cause the intensity of type 2 to jump. And then for simplicity here, beta, I made these decay values all the same. So let me give you a more concrete example here. And I'm going to use my dog Murphy here to go and help you. So this is my dog Murphy. This is his arch nemesis, my neighbor's dog. Actually, I don't have a picture of my neighbor's dog, so I just found a stock photo of a dog that looks like my neighbor's dog. And I'll give you a little bit more background information. In the front yard of my house, I have a fire hydrant. Anybody have a dog? What do dogs like to do with fire hydrants? Pee. Yeah, a dog likes to pee at the fire hydrant. So the event, we have two events of interest. Event 1 is my dog pees on my fire hydrant. Event 2 is my neighbor's dog pees on my fire hydrant. Okay. So here is one possible realization from this model. So let's say the red here is my dog Murphy. This is Murphy's intensity of peeing on my fire hydrant. Blue is my neighbor's dog. So notice at time 1 here, there's an event of type 1. So my dog Murphy peed on my fire hydrant. This is self-exciting in that it causes my dog to be more likely to pee on my fire hydrant again in the near future. So he does this sometimes. I take him out for a walk. He pees on the fire hydrant on the way out. And when we get back to my house, he pees in the fire hydrant again. So the fact that he peed on the fire hydrant the first time makes him more likely to do it in the future. And notice, it also makes the other dog more likely to pee on my fire hydrant if he's out for a walk and he goes, smells it, decides, hey, I got to do this too. Right? Similarly, when that dog now pees on my fire hydrant, it now excites both his events and Murphy's events. And so we have these two interacting processes. So this is a simple case of just, two different variables. But this shows you how, one type of event can excite both itself and other types of events. Now, if we want to go and this is two, right? This is two types of events. And so you can use this to model, let's say, two people messaging each other, So you can have, this is, the reds could be, I send a message to you. The blues could be, you send a message back to me. Right? So we can have conversations in this way. But that's just, two people. This is this multivariate Hawkes process approach is intractable for modeling an entire network, just like this. The reason being, for a directed network with n nodes, there's n times n minus 1 pairs of nodes that we need to model. So the D, the dimensionality, is roughly n squared, which means we have an excitation matrix alpha that's roughly n squared by n squared. And so if this is your adjacency matrix here, let's say n is 4, the excitation matrix here is going to be 12 by 12, right? So 4 times 3, 12 by 12. And so if I have one entry here, 2, 3, I'm modeling, so this is, let's say, node 2 sending messages to node 3. The excitation matrix, I have to be worried about this entire row here and this entire row here. And by the way, when I say this isn't 12, 13, 14, this is 1, 2, 1, 3, 1, 4, and so on. And so we have this excitation matrix, and since it's n squared by n squared, notice directly estimating the entries of this matrix becomes intractable, even if n is pretty small, like 100. Even if you have 100 nodes, that's a pretty small network. Well, now this is 100 by, so 100 squared, so 10,000 by 10,000. And so this, directly trying to estimate this is intractable without giving it some additional structure. And what people have tried is to use some generic structure here, like let's say a sparsity and a low rank penalty. And that seems to work pretty well for n squared being in the hundreds or thousands. But as n gets very large, those generic structures are not enough. And so this brings us now to my contribution, where we're trying to build these probabilistic generative models for continuous time networks, where we use the network, where we use the fact that this is a network to apply some more specific structure to this so that we can resolve this problem. And so the basic idea here, we want to build a continuous time network model where we take a generative model for the network, like the stochastic block model, and augment it with a temporal point process, like the multivariate Hawkes process. And then depending on how you do this, so this basic idea, there are a lot of models with this basic idea. I would say if you look back like 5-6 years ago, there wasn't a lot of literature out there. So this was what the landscape looked like prior to 2018. And then since then, there's been a big explosion, including a lot of work from my group here. And so the contributions from my group here you see in red. And I'm comparing these models by scalability and flexibility. So scalability is how big of a network we can scale the estimation procedure to in terms of the number of nodes. So you see different models range from hundreds to, let's say, millions. And then here I have what I'm calling the flexibility, the number of I shouldn't say features, the number of properties that you can replicate from your networks. And so today I'm going to go and briefly talk about two models here in this landscape. So one's called CHIP, one is called MULCH. And by the way, this was current as of last year. In the past year, there's been even more papers that have come out here, and this is stretched out even further. And so the first model I want to talk about here is called CHIP, Community Hawkes Independent Pairs, a highly scalable but not very flexible model. So this was joint work with my former master's student, Makan Arastui at University of Toledo, and Shubhadeep Paul, who's a statistics professor at Ohio State. And in this model, so we've got 4 parameters here, a length k vector, pi, and then 3 k by k matrices. These are mu, alpha, and beta for the Hawkes processes. And so in this model, we assign each node to a community A with some probability pi A. So that's what this vector is for. That's a prior probability that a node is in a community. For each node pair in that community or block pair AB, we generate the event times from a univariate Hawkes process that has these shared parameters for duration t, whatever the length of our data trace. So if you want to look at your adjacency matrix, so you can, let's say here we have these two communities. You can divide it up into this block structure here, where each node pair in the network will follow a Hawkes process with parameters that are shared across all node pairs in that block pair. So this is your stochastic block model like structure. And so each node pair follows an independent Hawkes process. So you have a univariate Hawkes process. Basically what this means is we're assuming a diagonal excitation matrix alpha. Remember I said estimating a full matrix is intractable. So we're going to assume it's diagonal. And to put even more structure on it, not only is it diagonal, but some of the entries are shared. So all of the diagonal entries for node pairs in the same block pair share the same alpha. So this is a huge simplification. And let's see how I'm doing. I'll go over these briefly here. So to try to estimate these parameters, the basic idea is we do a community detection step. We run spectral clustering on either a weighted or unweighted adjacency matrix. If it's weighted, the weights are just the counts of the events between any two nodes. We have closed form estimators for the Hawkes process parameter for the base intensity, mu, and then for the ratio alpha over beta. So these are method of moments estimators in closed form. And if we want to actually recover alpha and beta separately, we can substitute these estimates, just plug them into a standard Hawkes process log likelihood to go and then isolate one of the terms. And you can just run a scalar optimization here on that one parameter. So very fast estimation procedure. I want to point out the first two steps use only the counts of events. It's only in step 3 here where we need the times themselves. And so since this is a very simple model, a very simple estimation procedure, we can provide some theoretical guarantees. The first one, this is pretty straightforward, is the spectral clustering on the unweighted adjacency matrix is consistent as n goes to infinity. So the number of errors we make goes to 0 as the network size grows to infinity. And so this one, I say this one is straightforward. There's a paper by Lei and Ronaldo in 2015, basically with a sketch of how to prove these kinds of things. You can just basically plug it straight into their sketch. The second part here on the weighted adjacency matrix, we show that spectral clustering on that weighted adjacency matrix is consistent as both n and t go to infinity. This one requires a little bit more work because this is a count matrix, not a binary matrix. But if you find a suitable bound for the deviation of the counts from their expectation, you can then plug that into Lei and Ronaldo's proof sketch. And what we see here, the misclustering error rate from both of these adjacency matrices, for finite k, n, and t, it varies as k squared divided by n times t. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
What's the there must be some block structure like the connection blocks. Get the spectral cluster.
So the first one, the one on the weighted adjacency matrix here, we're assuming that t is going to infinity, and so that basically what we're seeing here, the deviation of the counts from the expectation is not too high. The first one here is just the standard assumptions from a stochastic block model. So different proofs will have different assumptions on how quickly the degrees need to grow. So some people assume that the degrees grow logarithmically, and so there's some assumption there on how dense that network has to get. You're right. And so for the first portion here on the unweighted adjacency matrix, there's no change to the conditions here. Basically, we just show that follows a normal block model. So whatever proof techniques used for the normal block model, those all apply here. And typically the assumption is that the degree is growing either logarithmically or polylogarithmically. So the edge probabilities can't be too small. Oh, so that's why it's n goes to infinity. Basically, as n goes to infinity, the blocks get bigger and bigger. And so you see more observations. So each time you get a new node, you get a whole row of entries in your adjacency matrix. Yeah, you're right. So that was for the unweighted case, and then in the weighted case, we just got to get another tail bound here for the counts. So that's the guarantees on the spectral clustering, that first step. Then we can also show that our estimates for mu and m, they're consistent also as n goes to infinity and t goes to infinity, and that mean squared error decays quadratically. And so this, at the time, so this was the first theoretical guarantee of estimation accuracy for a relational event network model. And this scales to networks with about 1 million nodes. And so basically, I'm going to go through this pretty quickly in the interest of time, because I want to get to my next model. But the simulation results show, roughly what we expect here is that. So if you increase as you decrease the number of blocks k and you increase the time duration, your estimates get more and more accurate. Similarly, as you decrease the number of blocks, increase the number of nodes, again, more and more accurate. And then as you increase the time duration and increase the number of nodes, you get more and more accurate estimates. And then the parameter estimation accuracy, the predicted mean squared error from our theory that decay is 1 over n squared. Our guarantees are only on mu and m. And so you see the decay rate is roughly 2. So that's what we're expecting. We have no guarantees on alpha and beta separately, but we do see the decay rate is also roughly quadratic there. And so this here scales to about 1 million nodes. You have a very, very simple and scalable model. I'm going to skip the accuracy here. I'll come back to that when I talk about the next model here, the MULCH model. This is multivariate community hawks, highly flexible, I would say moderately scalable. So not 1 million nodes, but maybe about 10,000 nodes. And in this model, so we use a structured multivariate Hawks process. So the entire network, as I mentioned before, it can be modeled by an n times n minus 1 dimensional multivariate Hawks process, the roughly n squared I mentioned. It has this intractable, roughly n squared by n squared dimensional excitation matrix alpha. So we're going to make it tractable by using a structured multivariate Hawks process with some assumed structure for this alpha. And the first assumption we're making on the structure is that it's block diagonal, so that only node pairs in either the same or a reciprocal block pair can mutually excite each other. So let's say if I'm in block 1, you're in block 2, then events from other edges, from other nodes in block 1 and block 2, or from block 2 back to block 1 can excite each other. Right? Block 3, 4, 5, whatever, those can't affect the edges between blocks 1 and 2. And beyond that, we assume a limited set of excitation parameters inspired by this sociological notion of participation shifts. And so this is a sociologist, Gibson, who's just studying, how people interact in conversations and how the participation shifts over time. So how one person talks and then somebody else talks and directs something to somebody else. And we consider these different types of excitation. So we have a self-excitation. I think actually, let me go here, and I think this shows it. So let's say we have 5 nodes in this group here, 3 nodes in this group here. And the example I'll use is, let's assume each node is a country. So we have 5 countries here in the same group. Assume, let's say, a military alliance. 3 countries here in this group. Assume some other military alliance. So now let's say that country 1 has initiated some act of hostility towards country 8. Maybe a threat, maybe a declaration of war, economic sanctions, something like that. As a result of that, we can have self-excitation, that's this here, where country 1 then imposes even more action on country 8. So let's say initially I go and country 1 threatens country 8 does nothing. So country 1 now uses harsher threats or economic sanctions or something. So that's self-excitation. We can have reciprocal excitation. Country 8 does something in response to country 1. You threaten me, I threaten you right back. We can have this turn continuation, which is after country 1 threatens country 8, country 1 also goes and threatens country 8's allies. That's turn continuation. We have generalized reciprocity. So after country 1 threatens country 8 goes and threatens the allies of country 1. And then these last two, so these were really motivated by this militarized disputes application. We have allied continuation, which is after country 1 threatens country 8, the allies of country 1 also go and threaten country 8. So that's these green lines here. And similarly, we have allied reciprocity. So after country 1 threatens country 8, the allies of country 8 here come back and threaten country 1. So this example I'm using here is militarized disputes. We'll actually come back to that. What I want to point out here, this is the first model to go and incorporate these higher order excitations, which were initially motivated by this notion of participation shifts from sociology. And so this gives us a very specific form for that conditional intensity function that leads to an excitation matrix that looks something like this. So I'm going to skip over. I don't want to talk too much about the estimation procedure. It's not quite as straightforward. You run spectral clustering, and then we have this log likelihood maximization. The key I want to point is it's not as scalable, so we can go to about 10,000 nodes here. And if we look at predictive accuracy, so two ways of measuring it. One is predictive log likelihood. So let's say we fit our model to data on, let's say, the first 80% of the events, and then we measure the log likelihood on the last 20%. And so the models behind this line here were ones proposed by my group here. And so you see CHIP is the one that scales the best, it takes 1 million nodes. These two models, MULCH and latent space Hawks, another model from my group here, are generally among the best when it comes to predictive log likelihood. This other one here, this is link prediction AUC. So this is a different way of measuring things. This is saying that we take a small time window, and then we predict in that time window whether or not there will be an event. And again, here you see our two models, MULCH or latent space Hawks, are doing the best here. I think since then, in the last year, there have been other models that beat us now. But we see MULCH is more accurate. It can scale, but it takes some time. This Facebook data here had something like 40,000 nodes. It took 10 hours to fit it. But I mean, that's why we say it scales to roughly about 10,000. Our new latent space Hawks model can do even better on some data sets. That's, 1,000 is starting to push, 1,000 nodes is starting to push it. But what I really want to show here is the generative accuracy. So one way to evaluate generative accuracy is to check if simulated data from the model differ from the observed data in ways that we care about. So you come up with some statistic that measures the deviation between the observed data and the data that you generated, the fake data from your model, and then you compare the two. And so one thing we looked at here are temporal motifs. This is a 6x6 matrix here showing all the possibilities of 2 or 3 nodes and 3 edges, such that we maintain the order of the edges. So for example, this one here, it shows first you have one edge, this one occurs first, then this one occurs, and then this one occurs. So you have this 6x6 matrix of temporal motifs, and there are efficient algorithms to compute the counts at which these occur. And so if you look at this is the actual network, this is what the temporal motif counts look like. And then if you look from our MULCH model, the simulated network from that fit, it looks pretty similar. And in particular, this is a huge improvement over the previous models. If you look at CHIP, right? CHIP is univariate Hawks process. So there are a lot of these motifs that it just can't create altogether. And then this is another older model from my group, the block Hawks model. It creates almost all of the motifs at roughly equal rates. And so this is the only model that we have here that actually replicates those temporal motif counts well. And these temporal motif counts are important in many applications. So this militarized disputes I was talking about. We have dates and narratives of all militarized incidents between countries over a period of a couple decades. And these temporal motifs represent patterns of escalation of these militarized disputes. So let me jump to the analysis of this using our MULCH data. So using our MULCH model. So we fit this model using MULCH. And we see 4 blocks here. You can see the membership, which nodes are in which, the nodes here are countries. So which countries are in which blocks. And the first thing to notice, this first block, if you look at the countries here, these are all NATO members plus the UAE. And so one of the things we found there, so think of this, kind of like clustering. These are nodes that all behaved, in a similar way. And the reason we found the UAE here, we think, is that the UAE also took part with NATO in a lot of different operations. For example, the intervention in Libya. And so we were able to go and discover some of the military alliances themselves just from the actions that these countries took. Now, if we go and look to see, what kinds of participation shifts we see, so the self and reciprocal excitations are strongest. And so the scale of the entries here, roughly, we see it's like 0.1, 0.6, 0.8, and so on. So in the order of 10 to the power of -1. Next, we see allied and term continuation. Those in the order of 10 to the -2. And then the generalized and allied reciprocity, those are much weaker. So those occur much less. And so we see some things here that agree with what we would expect from from geopolitical events, like block pair 1-2. We see it has much higher allied continuation than other block pairs. Remember, allied continuation is my country threatens your country, and then my country's allies threaten your country. And so we saw that this much higher for block 1 to block 2. And so this, when we look in the narratives, well, this is mostly driven by the NATO members jointly engaging in disputes, such as Yugoslavia in 1999, Libya in 2011. On the other hand, block pair 2-1 has the highest term continuation. Remember, term continuation is my country threatens your country, then my country threatens your country's allies. And so this was mostly, Yugoslavia on its own threatening multiple NATO members in rapid succession. And so these are the kinds of analysis tools that I think are really important for these kinds of networks, where you can't just look at the matrix that hides a lot, the adjacency matrix that hides a lot of the structure. You need to use some sort of generative model here that can go and give you back parameter estimates to help you explain what's going on. Oh, let me present my summary here and shut it off. So probabilistic generative models here provide a powerful mechanism for modeling and analyzing network data. Latent variable models give you a flexible yet interpretable modeling approach, motivated. So in this case, we looked at models motivated by sociological principles like the stochastic block model. And in general, these probabilistic generative models provide a rich mechanism for incorporating network dynamics. And so what I showed you today here, we combine the multivariate Hawkes process with a static network model to generate these time-stamped relational events, and we can build different models trading off flexibility and scalability. And so just to give you some idea of what we're progressing towards, we're looking at more theoretical results, seeing if we can recover the parameters from aggregated count data. So can we actually throw away the timestamps and just look at counts and still estimate our parameters accurately? We're looking at generative models for time-stamped events with duration. So not just instantaneous events like messages, but things like, okay, this country initiates a conflict with this other country. How long is that conflict going to last? There's going to be some duration there. And also networks with measurement error. And finally, I just want to thank my collaborators and the funding agencies who have supported my work here, including the National Science Foundation, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and the NIH, National Institutes of Health. Thank you.
Any questions from the audience or from people on Zoom?
Yeah, let me pull up. All right, I've got the Q&A open if anyone wants to type in questions from Zoom.
Ask a quick question, maybe. Is there a role for graph neural networks in this kind of stuff? Not like just to play some small role or something, to understand something which there's not a lot of certainty in the model or something.
Yeah, so right, our models, the weakness of taking this probabilistic generative models approach. So I would say in the deep learning on graphs literature, they call what I do here as a prescribed model, in that we are sort of constraining the structure, and we can only find things that are within the constraints of the model we posed here. Maybe there's some other type of participation shift that we didn't consider, that could reveal a lot, but we didn't consider it. And so the effect of that has to go into other parameters here. So that's an open question is, okay, if the graph neural networks, let's say, can show significantly better prediction accuracy, maybe that's letting us know that there's something that we're missing here on our side. And then the other aspect is, in addition to the network structure itself, you often have more information about the nodes you can treat as features. Graph neural networks tend to do a lot better in that setting where you need to mix the features and the graph structure.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions?
I think we're good. I don't see anything from the
Okay.
attendees.
Well, we'll thank Kevin for the talk.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff.